a shout if there are questions or reflections or comments. You can do it during the presentation, or you can do it afterwards. I usually say there are, simplistically, there are 6 pillars of the Buurtzorg model that we like to talk about, that I think are really important. Number 1 is that we look at healthcare or home healthcare and care, that it has to include the social part. You cannot look at an individual as a diagnosis or as a set of activities, or what I like to say, a run list of support activities to be done. You need to look at each individual in their social context as well, to see how can you best support people, basically. The next one is focus on relationships. I actually had I hope that's not the case in Denmark, but I actually had a not a politician, but somebody working within the municipality, not in Denmark, in another country, who said, well, relationships, we are not sure that that's a good thing, that there are relationships. It should be a what do you call it in Danish? In Swedish, we call it en brukare. It's a user of a system. But our model is very focused on relationships, not only between the nurse or caregiver and the patient, but also between interdisciplinary, between the nurses themselves. We do believe that it's a relationship-driven, let's call it not industry, but what we're doing. We are as an organization very relationship-focused. We also look at it from, we tend, or our experiences with new public management, and if you look at a typical industrialized model with processes, breaking down processes, is that our model looks at creating solutions and individual solutions, and not focusing on indication and activities. So giving a shower, giving food, or giving something, those are activities. And we focus more on what is the, if you like to do more technical terminology, what is the problem statement for this individual, and how can we find a solution to create a positive outcome. We also looked at and said that, gee, cricket. When we started in Holland, I think it's now 13 years ago. Actually, in Sweden, it will in October be 10 years. But when we started in Holland, we did not have an IT solution. We looked, let's call it in the market, and we said, what we found out was that all the systems that we could identify were initiated, designed from a top-down and a control point of view. It was not designed from the primary process, the nurse, the caregiver. So maybe you are very fortunate in Denmark, but I have not heard anyone so far from being a nurse or caregiver to say that, yeah, the system that we're using to register, to report and do things, it's really a good fit with the work I do. So we said we need to separate in our system, and we decided to design our own, to separate the need of the back office and do not allow the back office or the control or the management to decide and determine how the nurses, how they do the job. A very practical example. You go into a client, you have 6 things to do, and for some reason, might be different in Denmark, in Sweden, every 11 million of the Swedish people, there are the same amounts for taking a shower. And then they have social activities, they have an activity of helping to put on stockings, or to get dressed and so on. And for the nurse, when she was looking at the system, she's saying, I'm doing all of these integrated, so I can't split them. So we decided to say we need to have a process for our nurses and caregivers that is really reflecting their work. And then we need to look at the needs of the back office. The fifth, I should say, box on this one is that when we then created our own system, we said, we are going to have a distributed, typical communication is top-down. So we said, when we don't have a top-down, but we have a flat organization, we need to create an environment, let's call it an IT environment, that not only provides the operating system and doing all the stuff that you need to do, but how do we maintain culture, knowledge sharing, and a community for the distributed organization model that fits the way we organize. Quite a long time, I still think most people in Buurtzorg will say, well, it's kind of the Buurtzorg Facebook. But you have one login, you have your operating system, you have your personal administration, you can get your tools for doing whatever medical you need. You also have an ability to connect with other colleagues around the country. You can even find on a map that if you have a condition that a team is not used to have, you can find people with experience and special competence in that and say, reach out to your colleagues and say, guys, what's your experience? Can I get support? And the sixth pillar is that our whole model is based on, it's designed to go back to what most people would say, that's kind of like what we did 30 years ago. The scale is based on a neighborhood approach, not the industrialized larger groups planning and doing things from a scalability or from a productivity point of view. We are quite going back into looking at a neighborhood because most neighborhoods have their own specificities, their own profiles, their own challenges. It might be an elderly neighborhood, it might be young people, it might be social challenges, and the way you do things might be quite different. I took there a technical pause to see, just to make sure, because I tend to just ramble on, to at least give a pause. If you have questions or thoughts, feel free. So why was Buurtzorg started? I certainly recognize this from, I'm gonna dare to say, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, France, UK, pretty much all the Western countries. There has been a tendency for the fragmentation of cure, care, and prevention, both from an operational point of view, but also from a financial point of view and from a responsibility point of view. Usually the home health care part is governed and owned from a regional point of view. Home care is usually governed and financially carried by a municipality point of view. Then you have a separation with the team from the hospital would do a few weeks after you're released from the hospital. You have end-of-life care, which is another team. You have rehabilitation is another team. You have so many different stakeholders in the design that the fragmentation is difficult between cure, care, and prevention. We also saw in Holland that there was a standardization of care activities. It became a rate card with activities, times per activity, cost allocated by activity, and it became quite industrialized. What we saw in Holland was that, the traditional industrial view on it is that you break down a process into activities. You apply the cheapest cost to each activity, and then you put on top of that a rigorous quality assurance program. And the theory is that you will get the highest quality to the lowest cost. And then some person threw in the factor that is very difficult to manage from an industrial point of view: people. So together with that, I think in the Nordic model, we have this freedom of choice and so on. And what we saw on that one is that a lot of the reimbursement models actually promoted that to give a lot of care to the lowest cost is profitable. We also saw that big capacity problems. I think from a demography point of view, I think we all share that in the Western world, that the demography, this is an increasing challenge. Unless we do something different, are we going to be able to afford it? Capacity problems, which also comes down to a point in my later one. I think we have been quite successful of if not saying, but at least acting, that anybody can do elderly care. So we have quite a low status, we have quite low reimbursement, and the way that we act, maybe it's not that difficult to understand why it's difficult to attract or to well, I think attract is good word for it, to attract people into the care, but also if it's going to continue to grow, it's almost exponentially on how much hands and feet we need to throw at it. At that time in Holland as well, very little information on cost by outcome. So going back to the point earlier, just provide activities to low cost, but it was really not a lot of information on what is the outcome of it. Are we doing good, bad? Are we doing the right things? I think in Denmark have the same problems as we have, or especially the elderly care. There are way too many people coming into elderly people's home. I saw, I'm going to link a little bit to my experience in Sweden. I saw now in the municipality that Buurtzorg, where we're active in Sweden, it was on the, I think the number 5 or number 6 of being best in Sweden for having the least amount of caregivers over time with clients. And I think that was around 13 or 14. That was the average number. And in this municipality, I think Bursa has about 50% of the care, and our number was at 8. So if you take the average on average, but I do think that the high number or the amount of people coming into our homes or elderly homes, I know me personally, I do not want 20 different people in my house to do something. So if you're suffering from memory challenges, or if you're in a position that you need it, my view is that, well, they certainly don't need it. And we also have, and in Holland, when it started, the nurses and caregivers were not happy. And it's not as simple as pay. There was a lot of reasons. So that was the base why Joss and three others sat down and said, we want to do this different. And that's where Buurtzorg started.
Shall we just maybe ask if these problems are actually being recommended also by the people in the network?
Absolutely. I would love to hear.
Will anyone say that that some of these points they cannot recognize as being a problem in Denmark? I think maybe the silence is that we have the right starting point also in Denmark, so to say, or starting point where you were also in Holland. So please carry on, John.
Yeah. So I'll go to the next one. So how was it started? We had a few from a Dutch perspective, right? And there are differences between the Danish context and the Dutch. In the Nordics, from the more southern. But there were a few things that we set as principles. We wanted to create teams up to 12 nurses. That was a fundamental to bring it back to the local context. And with nurses, I usually say you should read nurses as a combination of nurses and nurse assistants or caregivers. In the Dutch context, because there is a fundamental difference between the Nordic systems and most systems and the Dutch. In the Dutch system, we saw that one team could support a population of about 5,000 to 10,000. And we also said that the team is responsible for organizing the work and the complete process. Those were three pillars or fundamentals, if you like, that it started with. So I'm going to do this very quickly. We started one team in 2006. We were at 965 in 2018. I think we're just above about 1,000 teams today. We're, I think, at around 12,000 nurses. But we also have other spin-offs, if you like, because the care and the domestic support is divided different in Holland than in the Nordic context. So in total, I think we're now between 14,000 and 15,000 people. In Holland, the domestic care, like cleaning, shopping, and so on, is not included in the personal care and home health care. In the Nordic model, it tends to be that domestic care and personal care is put together, and the home health care, the clinical part, is kept outside. But this was the reason why I show this one is to say that we have never advertised for nurses or to start a team. In Holland, this was driven by nurses and caregivers saying that we want to do things different. Here is probably this is, I would say, the absolute most important part of the Buurtzorg model. So I'm going to take a few minutes to explain it. It's quite common, and it's quite easy to say, client-centered care, or the people independent and so on is important. What we have quite in all our processes, in all the way we work, we look at it is that our job is to support clients in their independence. We believe that absolutely the most people wants to be in control of their life. But you cannot look at a person as an isolated individual. No matter what we do from support organization, every individual is impacted, positive or negative, by the informal network. That is your spouse, your kids, your neighbors, whatever is around you that impacts your life, you can't look at an individual without looking at their informal network. Only outside of the informal network, we wrap the Buurtzorg team around the individual. So when we look at a client or a patient, we always assess, do they have a positive or a negative, or do they have an informal network? A lot of elderly people might not even have an informal network. They're very lonely. So how can you engage not only the Buurtzorg team, but also the community, and looking at the needs and the situation on the individual person? That also means that the Buurtzorg team becomes a little bit of a life coach coordinator with a formal network. It's very important that our teams have a strong personal relationships with house doctors, physios, pharmacies, the network in the community. But usually the Buurtzorg team ends up as the coordinator between them. So it's very much an inside out, empowering, adaptive, creating networks and supporting. And this is what we then call the onion model, but you peel layers, but the client in the center, but all clients do have an informal network that you have to consider.
Should we ask if there's any questions to the onion model?
I might have put everybody to sleep.
I don't think yet, but maybe there was someone would like to comment or have a question. Doesn't seem so at this point. Please continue, John.
Yeah. So self-organizing. So I'm going to make a bit of a comment that I think it is important for everybody to reflect on, because my experience is that 8 or 9 out of 10, they think the Buurtzorg model is about self-organizing team and that it will solve world hunger or whatever problems people have. It's very important to understand that the reason why we are self-organized is that for us, it's the only way to organize ourselves to support our care model. So what are some of the, I think, bullet points of the self-organization? Optimal autonomy with no hierarchy. So we want to empower people, especially our nurses and caregivers, but in the front line or primary process, built on trust. We have a fundamental, honest belief that if we support and facilitate, the caregivers and the nurses want to provide good care. And that is a cultural and a different one than an organizational question. We also say that we don't say, but I can say it, our culture in the organization is that we have a supportive and compassionate culture internally as well. One of the biggest tasks of back office and let's call it the leadership is to reduce and minimize complexity. Maybe it's different in Denmark, but the documentation, following procedures, and of course it's important to follow procedures, but it's taken more and more time on the complexity that in our view is endangering of diverting from the primary role we have to provide good care. And for us, ICT is also very important to be able to support that. The leadership we have, it's really common sense based. We have a culture of we're non-hierarchical. It's not anarchy by no way or means, but I think it's self-explanatory. In our model, we're also saying that competence it's not always one-to-one comparable to Holland, because it depends on the design in the context you're operating in. But we are saying that having higher competence is a good thing for quality, for care, but also financial. A registered nurse, if I had 2 painful lessons that I usually use on this with my dear wife, who is a nurse, because I'm not. And quite a lot of years ago, I said, well, why on earth would you, as a nurse, give somebody a shower that you can send a much cheaper caregiver to do? And my first lesson was that I was not a nurse. And I obviously did not understand that when she went in to give a shower as a nurse, the shower was secondary. She looked at skin condition, potential bed sores. She had a completely different view. And there's no disrespect for other caregivers, but an educated professional looks at things different. I said, well, explain to me then, why the heck do you go shopping and think that's okay? And he said, well, I'm interested in looking at in the fridge, what have they eaten and what type of nutrition is on the shopping list? And she said, for me, it's part of creating my view on my patient or client on the whole situation. So I'm very interested to see on what's on this shopping list and so on. So after that, I didn't bring it up anymore. Also then, part of the self-organizing, our teams are responsible for intake, for planning, for execution, they are responsible and they take responsibility for the care they give. We do not measure individuals in a team, we measure the team. Or make the, what we like to call, and most people recognize, KPIs. It's KPI on the team, not on the individual. We have a decision-making process, which is based on consensus and not the traditional, maybe, democracy where the majority wins. We believe that if you have 10 people, 6 vote yes, 4 votes no, it's a yes. You will have 4 people who doesn't feel that they have to take the ownership of the decision. So they have to negotiate and come to a joint decision that maybe not everybody prefers, but they all can live with it and take ownership of it. And we truly believe, and I think I would be interesting in everybody, if anybody had an opinion on it. We do believe that informal networks are more important and more effective than formal organizational structures. So you can make communication flow charts, organizational sharing and so on, but in the end, the most effective one is if people have a relationship and informal networks. That is something that we think is very important.
We have a question for you, John, from Tina.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Hi, John. And thank you. It's very interesting. And I like your focus on the cooperation between the team members in all the team, even though they are not educated the same way. But a question is, how do you secure the competences in the team, all the competences, when they are not educated the same way, when they are nurses and some are assistants? How do you secure a high competence level of competence for all of them?
Yeah. So if how do I answer this in a good way? When a team is formed and let's call it designed, it first of all it reflects the context you're in. So if you take Denmark, for example, most municipalities do not allow non-municipality organizations to provide home health care that might reside with the municipality. So if you look somebody only doing healthcare, of course, the team will be made up of, let's call it, lower educated than if you're only doing healthcare. But whatever that is, the team reflects not only the context, but also the culture in the neighborhood and so on. All of our teams have an educational budget. So usually we say 2% of the team in cost, time, and sometimes if needed. In Holland, we're quite mature. We have a lot of internal education. In other countries, we are not as mature. So some of the educational trainings are external with a cost. The team has a team budget, and the team decides what competence do we lack or need in the team. So to give you a couple of examples, one of the teams have an area where you have a lot of people with dementia problems. So the team sat down and said, okay, what are our skills, experience, education, and so on? For our community, we are not strong enough to for our population that we're supporting. So we're going to focus next year. We need 2 or 3 people, whatever the budget can allow. We want to have these trainings, or we want to put these on this type of education. We actually had one team in Sweden who said that we are going to take all our, there's a lot of online trainings and so on if you have the base education. And they said, well, we want to take the whole annual budget for this team, and we want to pay for 2 of our nurses or care assistants to get the formal nurse education or the nurse assistant education. So we and it links into how we do recognition and how we do, you know, I think in the Nordic model, you're going to meet your manager once a year to talk about your performance and so on. We have put that into the teams, that the team will sit down and say, what is our need in the team? What are the needs of the people? What are the weak points? And they come up with the educational budget. But all teams do have an educational budget. I'm happy to say at my time with Buurtzorg Sweden, which is very different from my experience in other organizations, quite often if the budget is tight, quite often the first thing that gets cut out is training and education. I'm happy to say that I haven't seen that here yet, but we want the teams to have the skill and education and training and ongoing that reflects the community. And the training and education is split into 2. I think you would have the same in Denmark. Some is mandatory work environment. Everybody needs to do a safe working training or whatever that is, right? To lift right and to not to hurt yourself. And then the team looks at the profile of our clients. Do we have clients or a profile that we need to strengthen?
We have a follow-up question from Seven.
Okay, great.
Hi, Shevin from Copenhagen Municipality. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I was just curious about the hierarchy. You have been the first one, because I had the impression that the team was included only nurses. But how is the hierarchy when you have caregivers and nurses in one team? And I guess it's kind of a bit the same as what Tina is asking for as well. And also I've heard that they have like the salary they get is the same. Is that the case with caregivers and nurses here as well? And how do you work with no hierarchy?
Okay, I will try to answer. and see if I can cover, I think there was at least 2 questions.
Thank you.
One is that even if you have in the team, you may have a nurse and, let's say, a nurse assistant or caregiver. Of course, there are different levels from what you're allowed to do and from a knowledge point of view. If you're a nurse, or if you have a certificate, or if you have something, you might have the authority or the responsibility on certain things that others may not have. From a team hierarchy, there is no hierarchy. Everybody's vote is the same. But of course, if you do in the team have a nurse, for example, who is responsible to make sure that you comply with hygiene, take now for Corona, for example, and somebody in the team has the task to make sure it's compliant, and to have that responsibility, you need to be a registered nurse for that topic. That person, I would say, would be an authority on the professional topic. The same as you have with, I assume you have the same in Denmark, that you have delegated home health care also to caregivers. If you're and if you're not, you're not. But there is no difference in a hierarchical point of view to making decision or something that is outside, in that case, of your area of special, if you like. You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
So in the team, everybody's equal to decide on team things. But if, of course, you do have something that the team has agreed, or that by default, we have 2 nurses in the team, we have 4 caregivers, and for certain responsibilities in the team, you have to, by the municipality or by the authority, you have to be the nurse, you have to be a registered nurse to have that role. Then, of course, for that part, that would be an authority. But it's not from a hierarchy in the team and the decision making, except for that speciality or that area where it's required.
I think that Bjørn also has a comment on this point.
Ja, det har jeg. Jeg skulle lige have slået kameraet til her. I'll speak in English so John gets this as well. I've looked a bit into how to translate nurses as it's used in the Buurtzorg model into Danish. Basically, the way Buurtzorg Netherlands at least talks about nurses, it would include what we understand as what we in Danish call sygeplejersker and social- og sundhedsassistenter. The levels of education are different, so it's a bit tricky. The numbers in the Netherlands are that 40% of the employees are bachelor nurses, 30% are have a 4-year nursing training that's not a bachelor, and the Danish assistants are pretty close to that. Then they have what is 30% that's called VIG, which is a 3-year practical education. It's better than our social- og sundhedshjælper. It's not as much as a social- og sundhedsassistent because they do not have the authorization that our social- and sundhedsassistenter have. So it's tricky. But basically, when it's being said, when nurses is being said, it more or less covers what we understand as assistants and nurses in Denmark.
Thank you for that, Bjørn. I think that was a very important comment. Now we have, John, around 5 minutes back of your presentation. Is that possible to do that?
Depends on you.
Pardon?
It depends on you. Let's make a shot, but I do want to answer the second question first. I'll do that very short. Like Bjørn said, there are I usually say there are 5 levels. level 1 is uneducated, you can say, get somebody in. Level 2, you might have a practical education, we call it, I don't know what you call it in Denmark, but in the older days, it was a 12-week or experience or something, so they would be a caregiver. Number 3 is, it's not a protected profession, but it's an education within elderly care. Usually in our context, people recognize nurse assistant. Number 4 is a nurse, registered nurse, and number 5 is a bachelor nurse. When it comes to salary, in Holland, they have a national salary band for nurses. So it's the same. So if you're level 4 and you have X amount of years in service, there's a national band, and you can decide, oh, you have 6 years of experience. If you join us, you get 7 years. We add 1 year, but it's quite simplistic in my view. It's a easy model. In the Nordic, we usually have individual pay. So we have adapted, if you take the Swedish model, to end up where you comply with labor agreements, the common agreements with unions and so on, with the spirit and intention of the Buurtzorg model, and to let the teams themselves to assess themselves. But in the end, from a law and regulation point of view, in Sweden, we cannot get away that the responsible for the service needs to set individual salaries. And to be honest, we just did it last week, negotiate with the union. So I hope that a little bit described on that there are differences. I will move on, being conscious about the time. I want to show you a little bit what the result was. The first 2 are from a scale to 0 to 10. So patient satisfaction was high, employee satisfaction was high. We were voted 5 times as the best larger employer in the Netherlands. Year number 6, we came in second after KLM. Then I usually joke, at least we have the same color. On the KLM is blue as well. We run the organization at an overhead of 8%. It went as far and has gone as far as all political parties, irrespectively left, right, or center, recommends other organizations to organize the work similar to Buurtzorg. There was, can't remember, KPMG or PwC, but it's an inconclusive research they did that the Buurtzorg model can achieve up to a total, in other industries to talk about landed cost, but total cost, large reductions. We are currently, I think, between 25 and 30 different countries. I know I'm working with about 12, and then the rest is in Asia. And that we're seeing that this teal or this conscious way of working, well, I think you all experienced that it's not a hype. It's in general a lot of discussions around it. So, considering we should have about 3 minutes left, some reflections on Sweden. In 2011, on the left side, there was a nurse, a Swedish nurse, who had been in Holland, tried the traditional organization, worked in, what do you call it, addiction care in Sweden, in elderly care, in hospitals and so on, and tried to work in a traditional organization in Holland. She found Buurtzorg and decided to move back and agree with Joss in 2011 to move back to Sweden. And hey, good-hearted, inspired, and completely ignorant, oblivious to what the world looked like in Sweden. So she started in the fall of 2011. There were 3 of them. They had 0 clients and the office at the kitchen table. In last year, in FTE, full-time equivalents, just about 140 clients, and 4 teams. They all are autonomous, have their own offices. That's what they've done so far. Experiences. Positive experience in the Swedish context. And the Swedish context is quite similar to the Danish context. So there are pros and cons. And maybe here, I hope you have 5 minutes to spare if you're interested to ask questions, because it's very difficult to explain the differences. The positive ones, though, is that the onion model to look at each client or user or patient, whatever word you use for it, from an onion model point of view, that you cannot look at an individual without looking at their informal network. That was a very positive experience, that whether you include home healthcare or however you do it, that works. The way to work holistically and focus on solutions instead of activities, that was also a very positive experience. It was not easy, because most of the people who started to work with Buurtzorg Sweden had never in the professional life actually experienced to work that way, to think themselves, to make decisions and look at it from a different perspective. Most of them were used to being told what to do and follow a run list. A high continuity, to have smaller teams and building relationships with clients came natural when you got to know them. They didn't have to tell their story 4 times a week to new staff on how they like to have their glass of water put on the table, or they were grumpy on certain days, and how you can get them to shower if they were grumpy versus not, and so on. So it built very strong relationships. To work solution focused is challenging, because it's different on how people have been, how they are used to grow from being very insecure, do not want to make decision themselves or find solution. It's you follow the script. We all see thin organization is cheaper and it is more effective. I think we have, or the people running Sweden, I'm not one of them, I just support them. They have shown that you can get higher quality, you can get the financials acceptable, sustainable. It is more effective and it is cheaper. Another one is that when you give trust, we have learned that giving trust creates accountability and responsibility. When people feel trusted, they tend to take ownership and responsibility. We have also seen that there is a large potential, but you need to support, guide. It doesn't come just because you sit in a management meeting and say, now we're going to trust them, and now this is going to happen overnight. But there is a large potential when you put all the bits together. And we work quite a lot on the last point, what we call intervision, with nurses and caregivers sitting down together. Somebody brings up a problem, getting explorative questions from others, coming up with suggestions and so on. That group intelligence is greater than the hierarchical decision making.
Excuse me, could I ask a small question?
Of course.
How did you actually educate the staff to take decisions and to take responsibility in this new way to work? It's a topic that we are working a lot in right now, and we haven't got the solution yet.
Okay, so what we have, so over the 13 years that we do in Holland is that, and to be honest, we started with this common sense, right? And over the years, as we grew, it has worked into a number of tools, methodologies, principles, framework, and a number of different topics where what is important. So if you take, for example, the work that we're going to support Sydjush and Hudderslev, is a number of this where we say, for us, these are the tools that you have, in our view, you have to have them in place, because without the tools, you cannot achieve it. And the tools and methodologies you can implement. My biggest concern is that organization and people believe that you can implement the Buurtzorg model. And I say, you can implement the tools, but how do you implement a culture change? Or how do you implement trust? But from how a team hold a meeting on how to deal with solution-driven, what roles needs to be in place, how to deal with conflicts, or how do you avoid conflicts, all of those are, and in all fairness, there are different methodologies. We have what we have developed to support, because the only thing we do is home care and home health care. We have developed on the tools that we believe, unless you put that in, you're going to come back in 6 or 12 months and going to have to redo it. Is that an answer?
Yes, thank you very much.
So the challenges, to be the last one, I'm sorry if I draw over time, but I have a tendency to ramble. Challenges, from the Swedish, but I'm gonna call it Nordic. The fragmentation and new public management is a huge challenge to that our systems look at either free choice, free competition, activities, KPIs, smart controllers, coming up with great Excel sheets, driving behaviors. That is a challenge. The way we want to do it is that if you look at Buurtzorg, we are private or non-public, but in the end, we're all needed. We like to collaborate, sit down and see how do we do it better and so on. But in the current system, at least in Sweden, it's very difficult because you're seen as a supplier. And here I'm going to be a little bit provocative. There are way too many spreadsheet controllers making calculations and driving behavior without having any clue what it means to what the frontline process is. The other one is that from a scaling, if you look at the Dutch context, we scaled extremely quick. In 13 years, going from 1 team to 1,000 teams. But in Holland, we have a national, more of an insurance setup. So if you get approved with an insurance, you can do it anywhere in the country. In the Nordic context, more often is that each municipality requires a contract and agreement. They might have different IT systems. They might have a different financial reimbursement systems. They might require different management in different municipalities. So it's very difficult to scale. I think the standardized activities comes back to new public management. I do think there is not enough focus on outcome, prevention, and long-term benefits, which I also believe is in our model. The problem in the Nordic is that usually the healthcare, from a budget and from a governance point of view, sits on a region. The home care sits on the municipality. So looking at the typical reality for me from a municipality is that you work with a budget year, you work with a budget, and the long term, or to make investment in prevention and so on, if the cost falls on the municipality and maybe the benefit falls on the region, makes it very difficult for a financial controller on the municipality to say, this is a good thing. We should invest because the region will save money. So for me, that design we have creates a challenge, if you like. It's also very regulated, strict, top down. So it's not common to have a lot of own space, that teams and professionals are allowed to do things. My experience in Sweden is there is a challenge to align collective agreements and the trust-based organization. There is a challenge. You might have it different in Denmark, but I looked at the collective agreements as well as work environment agreements. They're all, the way it's written is based on the traditional manager, top down. Every other sentence have a manager do this, the manager is responsible. And to find this, if the team controls scheduling, work times, and how do you make sure that, do you really trust that it will be done in a good way, and are you even allowed? So there is I would say from a collective agreement point of view, the unions are in general very positive to the model, but the devil is in the detail. So that has been a lot of work over the years to find a way for both employer and the employee organization to find a trust base that it might not be 100% if you would read the details, but everybody's okay with it. And that goes as well, in my view, to the current laws, rules, and regulations. If you look at it from, I had a meeting with a work environment inspector, which is I think regional one, and he was reading me the law, and I said, well, the problem with law is that it's all based on hierarchy. We don't have managers. And after a long discussion, he said, well, John, that's your problem and not mine. So I think this new way of the Buurtzorg organization is challenging the baseline, and there needs to be a lot of openness, trust, and discussion to say how do we move forward, because it would, for me, it would feel wrong to say it's all kumbaya and easy. There are areas where you need to find solutions. And I think the last one is, at least in Sweden, for me, was an experience that we have been successful in establishing that taking care of old people is low status. Anybody can do it. I learned over the years that taking care of old people is extremely complex, quite often psychological challenges, multi-medication, multi-diagnosis. But we have been quite successful in saying that it's a low status job, and that is a challenge.
Thank you very much, John, for this very comprehensive view into your experience with the Buurtzorg model, and also in the implementation in Sweden. And I'll be sure that we will get back also to these slides in our network, and also probably with some questions for you on the way this next year, where we're going to work with this in our different municipalities.
Hopefully people stop me, right? And feel free to ask questions and so on, when either by mail or through you guys or whatever. But I hope it gave you a little bit of it.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that. Thomas,